Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into what feels like a crisis facing a true cinematic giant, Wuxia.
Hmm.
You know, that whole genre of Chinese martial arts heroes, the soaring sword play,
Hmm.
the deep moral philosophy. It's captivated audiences around the world for decades.
For sure.
But this isn't just about, a few films that didn't do so well. We are really embarking on a forensic examination of the commercial pressures,
Yeah.
the huge artistic expectations, and maybe the systemic issues that seem to be threatening the very survival of this cinematic tradition.
And we're going to be dissecting a really fascinating analysis that came out in late 2016, provided a kind of systemic diagnosis of all of Wuxia's troubles.
And what kicked the whole thing off?
Well, what triggered this entire investigation was a major, a very high-profile box office catastrophe that basically served as the industry's ultimate wake-up call.
Okay.
So our mission for you, the listener, is pretty essential. We need to fully understand the critical data points that were signaling this market decline. We have to identify exactly when and why that historical golden age ended. And specifically, we need to isolate that critical shift in what audiences wanted.
And most importantly,
And maybe most importantly, we have to analyze the proposed solution for Wuxia's survival, which is this radical but maybe necessary return to character-driven narratives where the action actually serves the emotion.
And the focal point for this whole conversation, the huge warning flare that signaled the crisis, was the stunning, just undeniable failure of the film Swordmaster. We really need to look at this failure not as some isolated incident, but really as a symptom of a much deeper cultural and commercial malaise.
Yeah, because this was not a rushed production.
Not at all. This film had a serious, heavy-hitting pedigree. It was directed by Derek Yu, produced by the legendary Sui Hark.
I mean, titans of the industry.
Titans. And it had been meticulously prepared, often kind of stuck in development limbo for over a decade.
A decade.
And yet, when it finally hit the screen, it failed. It failed spectacularly at the box office. So, okay, let's unpack this and start with the raw numbers, because they really do tell a story of shock and, frankly, rejection.
They really do.
So when Swordmaster hit cinemas in late 2016, the failure was immediate. And it was shocking, not just to the producers, but to industry analysts who had really pegged this as a strong commercial contender.
Well, of course. You'd look at the names attached and assume it's a sure thing.
Exactly. But the analysis notes that after 5 full days in theaters, the box office income had only just surpassed 60 million yuan.
And that 60 million yuan figure, after 5 days, we need to give that some critical context, especially for a global audience.
Right, because that number might not mean much on its own.
Not at all. For a huge production like Swordmaster, you're talking a period piece, elaborate sets, special effects, famous veteran directors and producers, the investment was substantial.
Yeah.
And while the exact budgets are often kind of opaque, industry standards at the time suggested that just to break even, let alone provide a decent return, a film of this caliber needed to cross a pretty significant threshold.
Which was what, roughly?
Usually considered to be somewhere between 100 million and maybe 150 million yuan at the absolute minimum.
Okay, so 60 million after 5 days is bad.
It's very bad. This 60 million yuan marker was described as being very far below expectations. It meant the film wasn't running, it was limping. Badly.
And what were the longer-term projections looking like based on that, disastrous opening?
Well, based on that initial trend and the really rapid drop-off in audience interest right after the opening weekend, analysts suggested Swordmaster would probably stabilize its total run around 80 to 90 million yuan.
And that's way short of that break-even point you mentioned.
Way short. And historically, that 100 million yuan mark had become this really important psychological and financial benchmark. It represented the line between a box office disappointment and a genuine high-profile commercial flop.
So falling that far short.
Falling so far short of that critical threshold, likely failing to even get its promotional costs back, it meant the film's performance was equivalent to what the analysis explicitly called a rotund failure.
A rotund failure, that's harsh.
It is. But it shows this wasn't just disappointing, it was a systemic rejection of a massive Wuxia effort. It suggested that even the combined star power of its legendary creators could not overcome the audience's complete apathy toward the genre itself. It was like the market had already rendered its verdict.
What's so fascinating here, and what really magnifies the sense of crisis, is the comparative context that this analysis draws. Because comparing Swordmaster to other films that were released around the same time, that's what highlights just how dire the situation really was for Wuxia.
It does.
The market wasn't depressed. The market was thriving. Its appetite was just directed somewhere else.
Exactly. The disparity is absolutely striking when you look at the concurrent releases. Swordmaster came out around the same time as that animated Japanese film, Your Name.
Oh, which was huge.
It was an immediate massive success in the Chinese market. It demonstrated a robust, active viewing public that was more than willing to spend money on high-quality, visually appealing cinema, even if it was made domestically.
So the money was there, the audience was there.
They just weren't choosing Wuxia.
But the comparison that truly, truly drives the humiliation home is the one with the film I Am Not Madame Bovary. We have to spend some time on this because the contrast here is just bewildering.
It truly is. I mean, on the surface, it makes no sense. Madame Bovary was an art film.
Right, a serious, non-commercial narrative directed by the acclaimed Feng Xiaogang.
And on top of that, the film was embroiled in this massive, high-profile public dispute with Wang Xikong,
The influential son of the founder of Wanda Group.
one of China's largest cinema chain operators. So when Wang Xikong publicly attacked the film, it resulted in Wanda Group, this dominant force in Chinese cinema distribution, suspending its screenings in their theaters.
So they essentially blackballed the film across a huge part of the country.
A huge swath of the country, yes.
So, okay, let's get this straight. On one hand, you have Swordmaster, a commercially intended blockbuster, legendary producers, full distribution support, a decade of prep.
Everything going for it on paper.
And on the other, you have I Am Not Madame Bovary, an art film embroiled in industrial warfare, facing a distribution blockade from a major market player. Logic would suggest that Bovary should have been the one to fail commercially.
And logic failed. Completely. Despite all that industrial drama, despite the limited visibility and the public controversy, I Am Not Mad. Madame Bovary still managed to gross an astonishing 380 million yuan.
380 million.
Think about that difference. 380 million for an art film facing serious commercial obstacles versus Swordmaster's likely 80 to 90 million yuan total.
That's not just a big difference.
It's not. It suggests that even controversy, even internal industrial conflict, was less damaging to a film's commercial prospects than just being a traditional Wuxia film.
That is a staggering defeat. It completely undermines any perceived strength of the genre's heritage. How did the industry even react to that raw comparison?
Well, the comparison wasn't just unfavorable, it was described as humiliating. The performance of Swordmaster next to this controversial art film was explicitly called pathetic in the analysis.
Wow.
And this visceral failure, it raised the most critical question for the genre, the question that really spurred this entire diagnosis. Has the Wuxia film genre reached a dead end without a way to survive?
A dead end.
It forced the entire industry directors, writers, producers to stop assuming that Wuxia's deep historical importance guaranteed its future success or its commercial viability. It showed that the mass market was actively moving on regardless of the quality or the budget you threw at it.
So we're looking at a genre that went from being, culturally dominant to commercially non-viable almost overnight, all triggered by this one tragic, high-profile failure. That transition from a golden age to this point of existential crisis, it must have been a long process. So let's delve into the historical perspective to trace how that decline happened.
Yeah, that's the only way to understand it.
I think it's important to start by grounding ourselves in the cultural significance of Wuxia. The analysis notes that only China, with its incredibly long and rich history, has the cultural foundation.
And the philosophical depth.
Right, and the literary tradition to produce these specific kinds of martial arts epics. It is a unique cinematic dynasty, entirely reliant on the foundation of Chinese folklore, history, and that concept of jianghu.
The world of martial artists and chivalry.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it is a dynasty. And like all powerful dynasties, it had its golden age, a time of peak influence and just undeniable cultural centrality.
And that period was the 90s, right?
That period, the peak of Chinese martial arts cinema, it truly flourished in the 1990s. That was when the genre felt vibrant, fresh, and just, centrally important to Chinese cinema. It was defining the popular imagination of what heroism and moral duty even looked like.
And these weren't just culturally relevant, they were commercially explosive. We're talking about masterpieces that really defined that era, films that set the standard for blending rapid action with these complex moral dilemmas.
We are. The analysis cites these iconic examples from that era. Films like Swordsman, The Eagle Shooting Heroes, and New Dragon Gate Inn. Absolute classics. And these films established a clear formula where the action was spectacular, yes, but crucially, It was inextricably linked to romantic intrigue, intense political maneuvering, and deep personal betrayal. They set the standard for what Wuxia was supposed to be. They were exhilarating escapism, but they were built on these solid emotional foundations.
And that standard, that formula, allowed the genre to transcend borders, which leads to the second major phase. It's international prominence.
Absolutely. Films like Ang Lee's Crouching Tiger,
Mm-hmm.
Hidden Dragon right at the turn of the millennium, and then followed by Zhang Yimou's Hero.
Hero.
Those films propelled the genre onto the international stage. These works introduced this high-art choreography, lush cinematography, and these really complex philosophical narratives to global audiences. For a time, Wuxia wasn't just Chinese cinema. It was synonymous with sophisticated, world-class epic filmmaking around the globe.
It really solidified Wuxia as an art form with true universal appeal. It proved its foundational concepts, honor, duty, justice, were globally resonant.
They were.
But then, according to this analysis, something critical shifted. The momentum stalled. The critical turning point, the beginning of the cracks in that foundation, is identified as the period after Hero.
Yes, and this observation is crucial, since Hero, genuinely innovative works within the genre films that either pushed the visual boundaries in a major way or updated the narrative structure for a new generation, they've become exceedingly rare.
So it wasn't an overnight collapse into failure?
Not at all. But the genre entered this phase of artistic stagnation and, frankly, repetition. Filmmakers kept reaching back to the same themes, often the same production styles, but the audience had begun to change around them. The genre found itself in an increasingly uncomfortable market position.
And this is where we see that critical commercial divide start to widen in a really alarming way. We had films that were getting significant praise from critics, works like Ip Man and Wong Kar-wai's The Grandmaster. Yet these films were not translating into the kind of major commercial box office success that defined that earlier golden age.
And this raises a really fundamental question that we as analysts have to address here. If The Grandmaster, a film of immense artistic quality, beautiful production design, incredible attention to detail, if that was failing to achieve blockbuster status, doesn't that suggest the quality argument is kind of irrelevant?
That's a sharp point.
If the audience rejected that kind of quality, how can focusing on a better story, as the later prescription suggests, possibly fix the problem?
It seems like the traditional definition of quality, artistic choreography, historical fidelity, deep philosophical themes, that was no longer what the mass market was paying to see.
Precisely. They were lauded for their artistic merit, their beautiful choreography, their depth of character by critics. But they weren't driving the mass market to the cinemas.
To satisfy the cinephiles.
And the legacy Wuxia fans, yes. But they failed to engage the new, broader audience. The analysis is very clear on this. This lack of blockbuster success for these high-quality, high-pedigree films was already presaging a market slump for Wuxia years before the humiliating Swordmaster collapse in 2016.
So it wasn't one single failure.
It was a slow, growing rejection by the mainstream audience, indicating that the genre had lost its cultural centrality and its mass appeal. It had become, commercially speaking, a niche product.
Okay, so the stage is set. We have a genre that historically matters, a string of quality films that fail commercially, and then this catastrophic wake-up call of Swordmaster. This forces us to address the root cause, which the analysis attributes not to the skill of the filmmakers, but to the market itself.
The market. It's always about the market.
Here's where it gets really, really interesting, because we have to talk about the audience, the single biggest variable in all of this. The analysis makes it very clear that the Chinese film market is in this state of constant, rapid evolution. And the biggest factor driving the decline isn't necessarily the films themselves, but a major foundational generational shift in what the audience prefers.
This is absolutely fundamental to understanding the Wuxia predicament. If we compare the audiences who were the core viewers of Wuxia back in the 1980s and 1990s,
the generation that grew up steeped in the great Wuxia novels of Jin Young and Oolong.
Exactly. If you compare them with the current generations, specifically the post-90s and especially the post-2000s viewers, their cinematic appetites are just radically different. They're driven by different cultural inputs, different media consumption habits. It's a whole new world.
And traditional Wuxia relies so heavily on these foundational assumptions, right? An understanding of the history, patience for slow character development, deep moral quandaries, and often these tragic, slow-burn narratives about duty, vengeance, the weight of history.
All things that require a certain kind of investment from the viewer.
So what are the cultural mechanics that are driving the younger generation away from this?
Well, the post-90s and post-2000s generations, they grew up in a period of unprecedented economic growth and, rapid technological saturation. They prioritize immediate emotional resonance and high-impact visual stimulation,
They're less invested in the specific philosophy.
far less invested in the specific philosophical concepts of the Jiangku world, that itinerant world of martial arts chivalry outside of formal government that's so obsessed their parents' generation. The values of self-sacrifice and deep historical duty are simply less appealing than contemporary concerns and, frankly, easily digestible entertainment.
So what are these younger generations preferring instead? You mentioned lighthearted fare, comedy, visual impact.
Their preferred genres are clear and they are commercially dominant. Comedies, films that are visually impactful and provide spectacle, which often means a heavy reliance on modern special effects, high-energy editing, or fantasy elements.
And romance.
And perhaps most significantly, romantic and lighthearted films. This represents a really clear shift away from historical introspection and dense narrative and toward contemporary escapism and pure entertainment value. They were seeking fun, not philosophy.
It's crucial we illustrate this shift with concrete commercial evidence because the box office receipts, they don't lie. What were the big films that confirmed this trend away from traditional wuxia?
Absolutely. The massive box office successes of films that dominated the market during this period are definitive proof. You take, for example, a film like Lost in Thailand.
Right, which showed the sheer drawing power of domestic contemporary comedy.
Exactly. Then there's Stephen Chow's The Mermaid, which became a massive hit by blending comedy with high visual spectacle and contemporary ecological themes, all delivered with this eccentric, lighthearted energy.
And you can't forget Tiny Times.
You absolutely cannot. Critically, we see the success of films like Tiny Times, which catered almost exclusively to the young, urban, female audience with a focus on contemporary fashion, romance, and highly stylized melodrama.
Let's just dissect those for a second. The Mermaid, in particular, seems like a great example of maximizing that visual impact and blending genres in a way that wuxia just wasn't doing.
It's a perfect example.
Yeah.
The Mermaid delivered big, colorful spectacle with accessible, fast-paced humor. It didn't demand historical knowledge or moral contemplation from its audience. It was immediate, it was fun, and it was visually arresting.
And you contrast that with the dense character arcs and historical settings of wuxia.
Right. The younger audience, whose consumption habits are increasingly governed by fast-moving internet trends and short-form media, they found the pace and the seriousness of wuxia films too slow, too heavy, and just too demanding.
And on the flip side of that, we see the traditional, dense, historically grounded narratives performing far below expectations. And the analysis actually lumps Swordmaster in with other non-wuxia serious historical dramas like White Deer Plain.
Yes, and that generalization is really important. It highlights that the crisis isn't just about the wuxia genre's specific codes of conduct. It's about a market rejection of traditional density.
Right, the heaviness of it all.
Exactly. Both White Deer Plain, a serious historical epic, and Swordmaster, a wuxia epic, failed to capture the mass audience's imagination because they were perceived as too heavy or too slow for the current viewing taste. They demanded too much investment from an audience that was looking for quick, high-impact, emotional, or humorous payoffs.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the challenge facing wuxia is less about achieving technical quality in the fight choreography,
Which is often still excellent.
and more about achieving cultural and emotional relevance for this new dominant demographic.
The films may be beautiful, they may be impeccably made, but the audience base that cares deeply about the historical or philosophical specifics of the wuxia world has just dramatically diminished. That audience is now the niche.
So it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it.
It means that regardless of the effort, the pedigree of the directors, or the budget involved, it becomes nearly impossible for a traditional wuxia film to achieve genuine blockbuster status and compete with mass-market comedies or visual feasts. The genre has been relegated to the sidelines.
That sounds almost insurmountable. I mean, if the fundamental preferences of the audience have changed so radically, how can a genre that's so rooted in a specific historical context possibly claw back its relevance without becoming something completely unrecognizable?
That is the billion-yuan question. And the analysis offers a rigorous, focused answer. A surgical adjustment to the genre's narrative priority.
So, if the market has fundamentally changed and traditional quality isn't enough, how can the genre possibly escape this wuxia predicament? The analysis offers a clear, actionable recommendation, a path back to commercial viability, and the necessary shift is a deliberate, urgent return to the characters.
This is the critical insight. It's what separates the successful Wuxia of the past from the failures of the present. It acknowledges that the old formula where great action was the primary objective and the story was just a frame to hold the fights, that just doesn't work anymore.
So action is still important.
Oh, well, action is vital and spectacular choreography is expected. The true essence, the pinnacle of great Wuxia cinema, is the perfect integration of action and story. They cannot exist independently of each other.
Can you elaborate on that concept of integration? I mean, what does that look like in practice, and why did a film like Swordmaster fail to achieve it?
In short, it means that a fight scene should not be a pause in the narrative. It has to be the narrative's climax. A sword fight must be more than just a clash of blades. It has to be a clash of wills, of history, of emotion, with immediate, identifiable stakes for the audience.
And a lot of recent Wuxia films were missing that.
Many of them prioritize technical perfection in the fighting, which results in these beautifully choreographed but emotionally sterile sequences. The character motivation is generic vengeance, justice, which just fails to connect with an audience that prioritizes complex personal drama.
So the formula for survival is simple then. Good fight scenes have to be accompanied by an appropriate, emotionally resonant story that is relevant to the viewer's contemporary emotional landscape.
Exactly. And
Right.
to illustrate this point, the analysis uses the gold standard, the film that successfully bridged that gap between artistry and commercial success and spoke to a global audience. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
It's the perfect blueprint for modern Wuxia.
It really is.
Okay, let's dedicate some serious time to this case study, because if this is the prescription, we really need to understand the mechanism. If we focus specifically on that famous fight between the two female protagonists, Yu Jiaolong and Yu Julian.
The analysis highlights this specific duel precisely because it transcends the boundaries of martial arts. This conflict is described as having an incredible emotional charge
And why is that?
because it's layered. It is simultaneously a breathtaking display of martial arts competition, but beneath the surface, it's a far deeper battle between two rivals who are defined not just by their fighting skill, but by their completely opposite life choices and their hidden, agonizing personal connections.
So the action, the movements, the weapons, the setting, it's all just the language being used to express a deeper drama.
Precisely. Yulin represents duty, sacrifice, and this stifled love. Jiaolong represents reckless freedom, youthful arrogance, and the passionate pursuit of whatever she desires.
Right.
And the analysis clarifies that the story explicitly encompasses martial arts mastery and a complex romantic rivalry for the affections of Li Mubai.
So the stakes aren't just about who is the better fighter.
Not at all. They are about jealousy, respect, resentment, over-wasted potential, and the heartache of a mentor-mentee relationship that has gone completely wrong. The fight serves to externalize all of that internal, agonizing drama.
This sounds like a complete re-engineering of the Wuxia premise. Instead of the action scene earning the emotional payoff has to justify the action scene.
That is the core difference. When the film prioritizes that emotional context, when the action serves the narrative, instead of the narrative being a flimsy excuse to get to the next fight, the emotional stakes resonate deeply with the audience.
Even the post-2000s audience.
Even the post-2000s audience that favors romance and emotional storytelling, the fight scenes become highly memorable not because the acrobatics alone, but because we are invested in who is fighting and why they must win or lose.
And the analysis argues that this integration is what gives the entire narrative its complexity and its three-dimensionality.
Absolutely. By weaving in intense personal drama, the romantic rivalry, the tragic self-control of Li Mubai and Julian, the films become richer and far more exciting than simple revenge narratives. And the result is definitive. These integrated films achieve success on both fronts. They garnered critical praise and commercial success. This provides Wuxia producers with a clear, successful model for the future.
But the challenge still remains. A lot of contemporary filmmakers seem to struggle to integrate these elements without making the story feel secondary. What did the failures of this era miss?
They often miss the subtlety. They assume that a complex plot structure equaled complexity. But audiences don't just want plot, they want emotional complexity. The failed Wuxia films often featured characters with these grand ambitions or moral struggles that felt abstract or, historical.
Yeah.
The audience couldn't project themselves onto these figures. Crouching Tiger worked because the emotional conflicts, the desire for freedom, the pain of unexpressed love, the clash between societal duty and personal desire, those are timeless and universal, regardless of whether you carry a sword or live in the 19th century.
So the critical lesson derived from the Swordmaster failure is that technical excellence and a famous director are simply not enough if the story fails to connect with contemporary emotional needs.
Exactly.
The sword can be spectacular, but if the heart driving that sword is hollow, the audience will stay home.
It's all about recognizing that the new audience is driven by emotion and immediate relevance. Wuxia has to stop being a historical lecture and start being an emotional drama that just happens to feature magnificent swordplay. That is the only path to reclaiming blockbuster status.
This has been a deeply insightful deep dive into a cinematic genre facing some really existential questions. It's clear the crisis is profound, but the prescription for survival is also clearly articulated.
It is.
So let's quickly recap the key takeaways for you, the listener. First, we saw the stark commercial failure of Swordmaster, a catastrophic signal that the industry could no longer rely on the genre's historical importance alone.
Then we noted the long historical decline that really set in post-Hero. It was marked by these critically acclaimed films that consistently failed to reach blockbuster status, proving that artistic quality, as it was traditionally defined, was just no longer a market driver.
Right. And crucially, we analyzed the demographic shift, confirming that post-90s and post-2000s audiences are overwhelmingly choosing comedy, light romance, and high visual spectacle over these dense traditional narratives.
And finally, the urgent prescription for survival. The genre must prioritize character depth over mere action spectacle, using Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon's perfect integration of martial arts and emotional rivalry as the gold standard for how to make ancient conflicts resonate with a modern audience.
So the diagnosis suggests that the Wuxia film crisis is not a crisis of skill or a lack of history, but fundamentally, it's a crisis of narrative strategy.
It is, and we know that blending martial arts and romantic rivalry, creating that crucial emotional charge, is a proven successful path. But that brings us to our final thought for you to consider. Is focusing on romance the only way out?
That's a great question. If Wuxia is to secure its future and reclaim blockbuster status beyond just niche success, it has to discover what new emotional layer beyond just romantic jealousy can provide that necessary three-dimensionality to its incredible action sequences for the post-2000s audience.
Could they successfully weave in social commentary that's relevant to today's highly complex society in China? Could they explore modern urban anxieties, issues of identity, or contemporary philosophical struggles through the lens of the traditional Jianggu? The challenge is to find an emotional core that the current generation genuinely recognizes in their own lives, and then tell that story with swords. That ultimately is the new path of the wandering hero. That is the ultimate challenge facing the Wuxia dynasty.